There is a video that has recently been brought to my attention, and which after watching, I concluded was filled with mistakes. Now, I don't want to attack the guy who made the video, I just want to simply point out the mistakes that were made in the video. Now, the video in question is American vs Russian tanks by Cynical Historian. I mean, it's more like NATO versus Soviet tanks, but still. As I said, I will simply point out the mistakes I've noticed in the video. First thing I want to talk about is this.
Got your basic BMP-1, but if that ain't the right fit, you got the bigger gun on the BMP-2, and then there's the Magnum size for the BMP-3. There's the Bertum 2, you can tell because those cute little wheels just hanging out down there. Then there's the assorted BTRs. You got the MTLB for water, and the BMD-1 and 2 for airborne ops.
First of all active service BMP-1s were converted to BMP-2 during the 1980s. I don't want to claim something for sure, but let's give it the benefit of a doubt that some were left. Now, MTLB and BMP-2 are both amphibious, and each have their intended purpose. BMP-2 is an infantry fighting vehicle. It's meant to transport some troops into battle and support the tanks and infantry. That is why it is armed with an autocannon, coaxial machine gun, and anti-tank guided missile launcher. MTLB's only purpose is to transport troops. Since it's armed only with a machine gun, it's not really useful combat-wise. And BMD vehicles are essentially BMPs for the airborne troops, but they can still swim, just like the BMP.
But the Soviets have a bit of a different approach. They really did believe in the whole throw everything at wall and see what sticks.
Now, this statement is only based upon the myth that stuck from World War II, where Soviets used numbers to overcome the enemy, which isn't really true. Now let's get something straight. Soviets did prefer to have the numerical superiority, but that does not mean their stuff was inferior. During the 1960s, the Soviet tank development really peaked, since they were the first to fully develop a tank with composite armor. Not to mention that they were also the first to adopt a smoothbore gun that used the AP-FSDS projectiles on T-62, and the tank could penetrate pretty much anything at the time. Now back to the composite armor. The tank I'm talking about is T-64. When it came out, there was nothing even remotely similar to it anywhere in the world. Why? Well, the tank had composite armor, which gave it extremely good protection for its weight. It was extremely hard to penetrate, especially since at the time Western countries still used APDS fired from rifled guns, which were inferior to the AP-FSDS the Soviets had. Not to mention that not long after T-64 was developed, it already received a more powerful 125mm gun, which gave it even better firepower than it used to have. If you think that they had a few of them, think again. Just in the 1964, the year it got introduced, 218 were made, and by 1968 they had 1200 of them. Given that in the first couple of years there were engine reliability issues, but all of those were fixed by the early 70s. So not only did they like numbers, they also wanted to have things that were good, or even better than the West had. And this did not stop there. In 1978, the 80B tank entered service, and this tank, again, was far superior than anything at the time. Keep in mind that at the time, Leopard 2 and M1 Abrams hadn't entered service yet. But even when they did, the 80B still had a lot of things that were superior. When M1 came out, it still used 105mm gun, and still used APDS. Although AP-FSDS was developed, it did not fully replace APDS until the early to mid-80s. But when M1 came out, Soviets already had AP-FSDS that could penetrate it, while M1 still could not penetrate the 80, or any other MBT Soviets had. Now, there is one thing which goes along with the numbers theory, and that is the fact that Soviets did not include thermal sights on their tanks at the time because of the immense cost of those, and rather stuck with passive and active infrared sights so they could afford more tanks.
They had learned that tanks were the key to success if another war were to break out. As one intelligence memorandum said, the Soviets concluded that the tank operating with adequate fire support had contributed more to the successes in World War II than any other ground force weapon. Moreover, they learned that to ensure operational success, their army had to have far greater numbers of armored vehicles than their opponents. The biggest battle of World War II was Kursk, and the Soviets thought it was won by their tanks. It was essentially their Battle of the Bulge, except for bigger and more important. By punching through the German lines, they learned that was the key to winning, which is exactly the opposite of what the US learned from World War II. We learned to always try to stop breakthroughs. So the Soviets wanted to break through the lines of a future war, whereas the US wanted to steadily push forward or mostly defend.
I disagree that the Soviets saw tanks as the key to winning the war. What they mostly got out of the Battle of Kursk is that they definitely needed better tanks. 1943 Battle of Kursk made Soviets realize that the Germans had developed some pretty nasty tanks, since tanks like Panther and Tiger were used, and their T-34-76 tanks could barely do anything to them. Then they developed the tanks such as T-34-85 and IS-2, but that's about it. Soviets used what everyone else did at the time. They did not strictly focus on tanks. Yes, tanks were important, but not the thing that would lead them to victory. Air Force, infantry, artillery, those were all things that mattered, not just tanks.
You see, NATO countries try to make their vehicles more generalized to suit every task. That way, they can be defensive when needed and push steadily otherwise.
I don't know what about the Soviet tanks such as T-72 or T-80 makes people think that they are for some certain role. Those are main battle tanks, they are supposed to be versatile. Also, considering the fact that most of Western tanks focus a lot more on turret protection than the hull protection, I'd go as far as to say that Soviet or Russian tanks are more versatile than those tanks. But honestly, I don't see what could any other tank do that the Russian tanks wouldn't be able to achieve.
The Soviets made totally different vehicles for every purpose, pumped out a bunch, and kept using the dang things for decades after they became obsolete.
USSR never ever used any armored vehicle decades after it became obsolete. Their tanks, just like American, British, German, etc., were being upgraded as the time progressed. There was a period in Russia when T-72B tanks were still being used, particularly until the 2012 when T-72B3 tanks started replacing them. But let's not mention the fact that US Marines kept using M60 tanks until the early 90s, and US National Guard kept using the M60 tanks until the late 90s. You see, it is sometimes necessary to keep old equipment running, and it's not worth condemning anyone for doing so.
Like, even though they had a main battle tank available in 1945 with the T-54, they continued to use mostly T-34s into the 1950s.
Yes, T-34-85 was used in the 50s because T-54 production hadn't yet reached the peak to replace all T-34s in active service. And I mean, US used Shermans in Korea. I don't understand what's the point.
The upgraded version of that original main battle tank, the T-55, can still be found in their reserves today, and that came out in 1958.
T-55 was completely phased out of service a long time ago, even in reserves. Russian reserves today consist of late Cold War tanks such as T-72B or T-80BV, not T-55. T-55 is just used for shows or are stuck in some museum. It is possible that they would bring out some T-55M2 tanks from time to time, but those are upgraded T-55 tanks from the 1980s, with composite armor, upgraded fire control system and so on. Very different from the original one that came out in 1958. What is more likely is that those upgraded T-55 tanks could maybe be reactivated like the old T-62M2 tanks that have been brought out for Vostok military exercise last year.
Here's a picture of a T-62, which entered service in 1961, and we had that thing fully functional from the supplies they left in 1988, including the ammunition. That picture was taken in 2009, yet you'll find Russians using these things today.
Okay, that picture means absolutely nothing. First of all, it's clearly visible that those are not Russian soldiers around the tank. The tank could have been taken out for a show. I mean, those guys around the tank don't even look Russian to begin with. They all have black hair and darker skin, which could suggest the picture was taken somewhere in North Africa or Middle East.
though they'll more likely have T-72s, which are still on active duty. They just don't want to get rid of these things. So that explains a lot of their diversity. They just won't let their vehicles become obsolete.
Yes, T-72 is still in active duty, but it's not the same T-72 that was used in the 70s and 80s. Active duty T-72s are T-72B3 or T-72B3 model 2016, which have modern fire control system with thermal sights, improved protection, firepower and mobility, to match the modern standards. Yeah, they are not the best, but still, they are modern.
That's why they were updating the T-34 as late as 1968.
Wait, is it 1950s or is it 1968? Russia in 1968 had no T-34 tanks in their army. Maybe some Warsaw Pact country had them, but Russia or Soviet Union? No way. Here it says these T-34s were active duty during this 1985 parade. What does that even mean? Active duty during a parade? They did not suddenly put them in active duty and brought them out on a parade just to put them out of service again. No, it had been a tradition since always to have T-34s on the Victory Parade. Even in 2019 you can see T-34s rolling down the streets of Moscow.
They never got rid of their obsolete armor, because they couldn't afford to manufacture a bunch of new stuff. You see, they were forced by their experience in World War II, their industrial capability, and general strategic doctrine into throwing everything at the wall and seeing what stuck.
If you followed what I was saying during the video, you will know that this is not really true. First there was T-64, then T-80B, and then when M1A1 came out, Soviets had developed T-80U with, at the time, new explosive reactive armor called Contact 5, which could decrease the penetration of even APFSDS projectiles. At the time, M1A1 used 120mm gun that could fire M829 APFSDS, and in 1989 it received M829A1, nicknamed Silver Bullet. The tests conducted on tanks equipped with Contact 5 later showed that M829A1 could not penetrate them, and thus projectiles such as M829A2 were developed in the early 90s. And it is only from mid-90s to early 2000s that Russia had problems keeping up with the West. Since the breakdown of USSR, Russia was in an economic crisis, and for a decade had problems keeping up. But one decade does not mean they always did that. I think that should be it. As I said, I have nothing against the guy, I just simply want to correct some mistakes. I don't want to come out as some Kremlin troll or something. These are just things I thought should be corrected, so I tried my best to correct them. Thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you all in the next video. Have a nice day.